Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester was very excited when he came home from school, said Mrs. Bovine to her mother. All week long he has talked about everything he wants to do at Grandma's house. Here I am, Grandma, exclaimed Chester as he ran down the stairs. I'm ready to go now. I got my toothbrush and my bear and my play clothes and hey, where's Grandpa? Grandma's eyes got really big. She was surprised by Chester's enthusiasm. Well, she said, he's at home fixing dinner for us. How's about them apples? Wow, blurted Chester. Grandpa really is an 80s kind of guy. Yes, he is, chuckled Grandma. And I'm sure you'll want to show your support by cleaning your plate for him. Oh, I'm sure he will, said Mrs. Bovine. Grandma reached for her purse and stood beside her chair. Then she turned to Chester and said, Well, Chester, let's not keep Grandpa waiting. Okay, answered Chester. Bye, Mom. Goodbye, Chester. Be good and mind your grandmother. I'll think about it, teased Chester. Bye, Mom, he said again. I'll have him home in time for lunch tomorrow, said Grandma to Mrs. Bovine. Chester ran as fast as he could toward the car. He was buckled into his seat before Grandma even opened her door. My, you are a quick one, little Chester, she said. Chester grinned to himself. Grandma started the car and off they went. When the car pulled into Grandma and Grandpa's driveway, they saw Grandpa in the front yard. He had a twig in his hand and was scraping his shoe sole with it. When Chester got out of the car, he heard Grandpa saying all kinds of bad words. Grandpa said words that Chester never knew existed. It was pretty neato. What did he do? Chester asked Grandma. He stepped in a cat mess, said Grandma. He does it almost every night, and every night he says he's going to get rid of our cat. Of course he never will. How come? Asked Chester. Because I'd get rid of Grandpa if he ever tried something like that. Hey, Grandpa, yelled Chester, don't get rid of that cat because of that. Grandpa smiled and said, Okay, Chester, the cat stays for as long as you like. Chester and Grandma went inside. Grandma went straight to the kitchen and began pouring drinks into Smurf glasses. She yelled at Chester to put his things upstairs in his spare bedroom. The food smelled very good to Chester and it made him hungrier every second. He knew it would be time to eat as soon as he came back downstairs, so he tried to hurry. In his haste, he tripped on a step and his bear fell down the stairs. Chester decided this would be a good time to try out one of the new bad words he had learned from Grandpa. Of course, he practiced quietly so Grandma wouldn't hear. Chester remembered his manners at dinner and ate everything on his plate. He was rude only twice, and they were both accidents. One was a belch after dessert, and the other was spilling milk all over Grandpa. Chester was a little scared, but Grandpa laughed at him. Chester sure was glad he wasn't a cat. After dinner, Chester helped with the dishes, colored in his coloring book, and watched some TV before going to bed. He went to sleep in a matter of minutes. Chester awoke later that night to the sound of rain on the window by his bed. As he pulled up the covers to fall back asleep, he thought he heard something sounding like a voice in the rain.
Chester Bovine, come look, get out of that bed. Chester Bovine, I know you heard what I said. Chester Bovine, come fly away with me. Chester Bovine, but leave your body be. Chester Bovine, just listen to my voice. Chester Bovine, you won't regret the choice. Chester Bovine, relax and just let go. Chester Bovine, release your inner glow. Chester Bovine.
There was something about the voice that made Chester want to fly away with it. He thought about the voice and what it had said, and began to drift back to sleep with it on his mind. All of a sudden he was in the air above the bed looking down at his body as it fell asleep. But Chester felt more awake than he could ever remember. He started zooming around the room, and without watching went through the wall to the next room. It was his grandmother's sewing room, which Chester had always felt comfortable in. He felt especially comfortable now, and just floated near the ceiling, enjoying the feeling, until he heard the voice again.
Chester Bovine, it's time for us to go. Chester Bovine, there's things you have to know. Chester Bovine, just float down through the floor. Chester Bovine, there's ever so much more. Chester Bovine.
So Chester floated down to the floor and went right through it. He realized he was now in his grandparents' room and saw them sleeping in their bed. He felt funny being there until he heard his grandmother's voice, which was not coming from her body. He then realized that his grandmother and grandfather were out of their bodies, just like he was. The three of them were about to discuss what was going on when suddenly there was a flash at the window. They looked over to see that Grandma's cat had come in, with its whole body giving off bright sparks of light. It shot through the air to a spot in front of them and glared at Grandpa. It made a scowl and then began.
You're gonna get what's coming to you if you don't stay away from me. Stay away from me, Mr. Human. You threaten to kick and I'll threaten to paw. You threaten to leave me and you feel my claw. You're gonna feel my sparks if you don't do what I want to do. Mr. Human, leave me alone, but don't leave me. Mr. Human, if you cross my path, I will cross your path, and you know what that means. We've been doing okay so far, but lately you've been overstepping yourself just a bit too much. This is a warning of what might happen in the future if you don't watch out.
With that, the cat threw an electric charge from the end of its tail at Grandpa, who was temporarily blinded. The cat made a smirk and then bounded out the window. While Grandpa slowly regained his sight, Grandma explained to Chester that they left their bodies every night. because it was the only way they could travel to the place they really lived. "But don't you live here in your house?" asked Chester. "Of course we do," responded Grandma, "but while in our bodies, we're restricted by its limitations and the way we're supposed to act around other people. It's like we're stuck in grooves on an old record, where it's easiest to just live by habit, or else everything gets disrupted. But when we leave our bodies, we can go to our real world and be more like what we really want to be deep down inside, and that's where we're taking you tonight." The light in the room started changing, as if it were swirling around Chester and his grandparents. Though none of them moved, the swirling light changed their surroundings. Chester was a little scared and held on to Grandpa for reassurance. Grandpa just patted his hand and smiled as the new world around them became solid. They were floating above a huge sunlit meadow that stretched to the horizon in all directions. Every now and then, there were brooks with trees growing along their banks. Chester floated down to the ground, pulling Grandma and Grandpa behind him. "This place is great," he exclaimed. "I feel like running and never stopping." "Go ahead," said Grandma as she sat down under a tree with Grandpa. "But I'm afraid I'll get lost by myself," Chester went on. "Then I'll never find you again." "Don't worry, Chester," said Grandpa. "In this world, all you have to do is imagine you're with us, and we'll be the next place you look." This sounded wonderful to Chester, and he couldn't wait to try it. He said goodbye to his grandparents and started running. In the past, whenever Chester had run, after a few minutes he'd get tired and have to stop. But as he ran through the meadow, he just kept going, and he barely felt it except for the feeling he got from his legs moving. It was like part of him was a machine that ran on its own rhythm. It felt really good when he thought about it. As his legs kept running, Chester realized he could forget about them if he wanted and look at the area he was running through. It was like looking out from a fast car, but even better. He could change direction whenever he wanted and wherever he liked. Up ahead, he saw a small building by a stream and stopped to look closer. There was a doorway in the building which was open. Chester walked up to it and peered inside. It was dark in there, and Chester could barely make out a figure sitting on the floor a few feet away. It seemed to be sleeping in that position, but Chester couldn't be sure because it was so dark. After a few minutes, his eyes got used to the darkness, and he could see the figure more clearly. He then realized that it was staring right at him, and it had been since he had stepped into the doorway. It seemed to be an old man, but at the same time, Chester kept being reminded of Grandpa's cat. The sound of laughter came from the figure, who then said, "Turn your sight this way, and I am that. Turn your sight that way, and I am other. Turn it all around. Turn it all around. Turn it all around. Turn it all around." The figure kept repeating this over and over. At first, Chester thought it was strange and kind of scary. But there was also something neat about the figure and what it was saying. Each time the words were repeated, they seemed to say something different, but not in words. In the darkness, images began to appear and disappear, but Chester thought it might also just be in his head. They weren't really clear, but they were connected with the repeating words. fading in and out like wisps of smoke. Chester began to lose track of what were images and what was the rest of his awareness. Then he was somehow one of the images, floating on the repeated words. He drifted slowly, with colors that flowed like a stream, until all sight and sound faded away. Chester's deep relaxation was abruptly shattered by loud sounds and flashing lights. But he wasn't really seeing them and hearing them in the way he usually did. It was totally different. Then he realized that he didn't have his normal eyes and ears, or for that matter, a normal body. When he had left his body, back at Grandma's house, he had still seemed the same, with the same arms, legs, body, and head. Only he'd been able to go through physical objects. Now he was more like a pulsating light, emitting different colors and strange sounds. He realized that he looked like the other lights around him and made similar sounds. He put his attention on one of them and immediately started floating in that direction. The flashing light somehow seemed to acknowledge Chester's presence, and he realized that he understood the sounds it was making, though it wasn't in words as he knew them. It was a kind of welcome and a suggestion that Chester follow the other light. They began floating together in what seemed like an upward direction. Their movement was slow, like specks of dust in sunlight, but it felt like it was the way the movement should be in their present forms. Other lights were moving in the same general direction, though it wasn't obvious at first. Suddenly, they felt a force control the movement, and they were swept into an incredibly huge and bright light. Inside the light, their own brightness was eclipsed, and they were essentially invisible. But Chester could still feel the presence of his companion light as they swirled around. There were pretty sounds, along with a kind of barking, part of an atmosphere of gentle energy that reminded Chester of when he played with his toys, especially his miniature circus set, where he would imagine shows where anything was possible. His thoughts of his toy circus seemed to radiate into the gentle energy and transform it. The transformed energy flowed back towards Chester as if for further directions, which filled him with a desire to imagine a circus show in greater detail. Then Chester realized that his imagined circus was as real as anything he had ever experienced, and he and his companion were sitting on bleachers with a group of clowns before them. Chester glanced at his companion and realized it was Grandma's cat, who winked at him. Together they looked towards the clowns, who began to sing.
We are the circus clowns waiting here for you. We are the circus clowns, we'll show you what to do. With our twinkling sparkle, we'll put you through the hoop of magical light and sound. We are the circus clowns, you are boy and cat. But you too are circus clowns, you'll prove it all as fact. With your twinkling sparkle, you're jumping through the hoop of magical light and sound. When you are ready to move through the magic hoop, create the moment we've all been waiting for, with your walking through, running through, or flying through the hoop of magical light and sound. Create the time to move through the magic hoop. It is so easy and is so fun to do when you're wading through, swimming through, or gliding through the hoop of magical light and sound. You are the circus clowns, you know just what to do. We are the circus clowns, we're waiting just for you, for your twinkling sparkle. You're moving through the hoop of magical light and sound. La 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 la. For you're dancing through, floating through, or drifting through the hoop of magical light and sound. Now you are ready to move through the magic hoop, create the moment we've all been waiting for you're dancing through, floating through, or drifting through the hoop of magical light and sound.
Chester and the cat then realized that they had somehow joined the clowns during the singing. They looked down to find themselves dressed in clown costumes. A sound then filled the air that made Chester grab onto the paw of his cat-clown companion. They looked at the other clowns and saw them lift up a hoop that was made of glowing lights. The sound seemed to be coming from the hoop. One of the clowns stood in front of the hoop, and the area around its body began to sparkle and twinkle. Chester just knew that it had to feel good from the expression that came over the clown's face. The clown then jumped through the hoop and didn't come out the other side. Another clown did the same thing, though it seemed to drift through the hoop. Soon Chester and the cat remained with only one other clown left, who was holding the hoop and motioning for them to take their turns. It was the cat who seemed more wary than Chester, and held back when Chester started to move towards the hoop of light and sound. "Come on," said Chester. "You're the one who's supposed to be curious." They both then moved closer and started getting a tingling feeling that tickled but made them feel good. When they got right in front of the hoop, the tingling got so strong that the air around them began to sparkle and twinkle. In spite of its previous reluctance, the cat suddenly leapt away from Chester and through the hoop. Chester didn't mind at all. He wanted to go through the hoop too, more than anything else. But all this was such a pleasant experience that Chester wanted to draw it out. He let himself float up off the ground and let the hoop of light and sound gradually pull him through it. Chester and the cat discovered they were at the edge of a group of dancers. All kinds of creatures were dancing, including the clowns, but the vast majority of the dancers were leprechauns, like the ones Chester had heard about on St. Patrick's Day. The leprechauns were mainly in the center and were having a great time leaping in the air and twirling around. They all landed at the same time and began singing. "Won't you come and dance with us? Won't you come and sing? Won't you share your joy with us and let your laughter ring? Come on now, kitty. Come on now, boy. Come on and join us to fill us with joy." Chester and the cat looked at each other and then leapt into the circle before they could change their minds. The leprechauns went on. "We knew that you would join us. We knew that you would come. Now that you have joined us, let's have some fun." Suddenly they took hold of Chester and the cat and began throwing them up in the air. Chester was scared until he realized that they always caught him coming down, and so gently he looked forward to being caught and thrown up in the air again. And being in the air was really fun. He started laughing and everyone began laughing with him. Then the leprechauns began throwing everyone into the air and catching them. Chester laughed even harder because it all looked so funny. Finally, everyone was put on the ground and the leprechauns went on. "We hope you liked our dancing. We hope you liked our song. We hope you liked our throwing you in the air so long. But now it's time to leave us. It's time for you to go into the land of floating where gentle breezes blow." The scene with the leprechauns disappeared from around Chester and the cat, and all around them were swirling clouds. Though they had been standing on the ground before, they realized that there was nothing beneath them but more swirling clouds. Gentle breezes blew the clouds away, and they discovered they were floating high in the air above a strange kind of landscape. There were people on the ground doing all sorts of things. It seemed the area around each person somehow adapted to that person. Chester looked at a man fixing a car. As he kept looking at him, he felt that he had become the man while at the same time still floating in the air. The part of him that had become the man somehow knew everything about fixing cars, and he knew just what had to be done next. Then Chester shifted his attention to a little girl who was playing in a sandbox. He suddenly knew everything the little girl had done, and that she was waiting for her friend Stephanie to come over to play. He enjoyed being the little girl and stayed for a while. He then realized that someone else seemed to be with him too, and got the sense that this was who normally watched over the little girl, helping her as she grew. Chester felt that he shouldn't stay with the little girl or any of the people too long, that he might get too caught up in their lives. So he went from one person to another, enjoying what each person knew and then going on to the next. Though he immediately forgot the previous person as he went to another one, he sensed that somewhere deep inside of him it was somehow being remembered. Then the gentle breezes began blowing the clouds back, covering the landscape below, and Chester remembered the cat had been with him all along. He wondered if the cat had become different people too, but it just smiled and gave no indication. Then, out of nowhere, some music began playing, and the cat began to sing.
Chester, you know that this is really neat and fun. I know that you are strong enough to take it all in stride. You've done this many times before, but really just begun. Each time you grow a bit more open-eyed. But then we draw the curtain to give you time to rest. Your memory gets cloudy, it's really for the best. Then you live your outer life back as a human boy. You learn to live the outer rules and learn to fill it all with inner joy. Chester, we all go through this many times and more. Your grandmother is quite a pro, she never does let on. Your grandpa and I really are the very best of friends. Next time he will be the cat and I'll have to make amends. Don't get too caught in what you see, it can slip away quite naturally, but then it all comes back again, you see it from the other end. But when we get distracted, our awareness gets retracted, we lose the things we've always known until we learn to find them on our own.
Chester looked at the cat with amazement. He realized that what the cat had sung about was true. He did remember going through similar experiences before, or at least this all did seem very familiar. His recent adventures seemed so real that it seemed impossible that he could forget them. But he knew that he had felt this way before, too. Chester wanted to tell his grandparents about everything he'd seen and done, and told this to the cat, who didn't say anything, but started walking down a path that had already been there, but Chester hadn't noticed. Chester followed the cat down the path around a huge rock. On the other side sat his grandmother and grandfather. It was where they'd been when he'd left them. "What is that cat doing here?" growled Grandpa. Chester was about to defend the cat when he noticed a joking twinkle in his grandfather's eyes. It had always been there when Grandfather had complained about the cat, but Chester hadn't realized it before. He then told his grandparents all about the things he'd done and seen, and it occurred to Chester that he had told them similar things many times before in this very spot. "Grandma, why don't you remind me that I do this all the time?" he asked. Grandmother smiled and said, "We all forget it most of the time. We've got to learn to remember on our own. Each time we remember a little more, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in intuition, sometimes when for no reason everything seems profound. Our reality back on Earth is set up to make us forget. We gain our inner strength by gradually learning to remember in spite of this. Now it's time to go back. You'll be waking up soon." Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester Bovine. Chester woke up in the bed at Grandma's house. It had rained during the night, but he hadn't been aware of it. Even though it was overcast outside the window, Chester felt excited for some reason, but he couldn't figure out why. He remembered he always felt this way when he woke up in the morning while visiting Grandpa and Grandma. He took his bear and went down the steps to the kitchen, where his grandmother was making breakfast. "Did you sleep well, Chester?" she asked. Chester then remembered a little of his dreams. "I dreamed of you and Grandpa and the cat, but I can't remember what we did," he said. Grandma smiled and kissed him on the forehead. "Why don't you go out on the porch until I finish making breakfast?" she said. Chester went through the door to the porch and sat on the porch glider. The cat came up and joined him, crawling into his lap, then raising its head and looking into Chester's eyes. As Chester stroked the cat, he felt he was forgetting something important. Then his grandfather was standing at the door saying, "Grandma says breakfast is ready. Come on in and make sure that cat doesn't get in the door." Chester noticed a joking twinkle in his grandfather's eye as he said this. After eating breakfast, Chester went into the living room to watch cartoons on TV.